So welcome to the ReFi In Action panel. Really happy you guys are joining us. I'm Craig Wilson from the Climate Collective. And I have with me Phil Fogel of FlowCarbon, Nirvaan Ranganathan of Climate Collective, John X of Toucan Protocol and Astral Protocol, John Ellison of Toucan Protocol and ReFi DAO, and Birju Shah of Loam. So, yes, exactly. So I'm incredibly happy to have all of you guys here. I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation. What we're going to try and cover over the course of the next 30 to 40 minutes is what is ReFi, regenerative finance? Why is it important for Web3? And what are some of the actual concrete projects that are happening right now? And what are some of the things that we can see out into sort of 5, 10, 15 years into the future for regenerative finance? So the first thing I'd love to do is just give everyone here an opportunity to introduce themselves really quickly, talk about their particular project, and then we'll dig into it. So I'll start with you, Phil, and then we can just go right along down.
Hello, everyone. Great to be here. My name is Phil. I'm with FlowCarbon. I've been in the crypto space for about 10 years now, and FlowCarbon is tokenizing carbon credits to bring them on chain and help basically get the flow of capital back to the projects that need the capital in order to continue doing planet-saving work faster and faster.
Hi, I'm Nirvaan Ranganathan, the program manager of Climate Collective, and we are a coalition of companies, products, protocols, on-the-ground projects, innovation networks, impact DAOs, and Web3 entities who are committed to combating and reversing climate change.
Hello, everyone. Some people call me John X, so you can call me that. My day job is with Toucan Protocol, where we're building Web3 building blocks for the regenerative economy. We've got about 20 million carbon credits that have been tokenized and are running on the Toucan meta registry right now. And our vision is to build regenerative actions into the fabric of our financial system so that just by having money and holding money and using money, we're flowing value to taking care of the earth. My main side project is a project I've been working on for a while called the Astral Protocol, where we're building tools to work with spatial and location data in Web3. So we're working on some technologies that we hope will underpin a new category of decentralized applications, location-based applications, as well as a lot of regenerative finance protocols that use spatial and location data to back these environmental assets.
Hey, my name is John Ellison. Sorry, it's a bit boomy out here. I feel a bit like a zombie in a massive tunnel. I can barely hear my own voice, but grateful to be here. I'm pretty new to this space. Fell in love with what was happening at the intersection of climate and crypto. Got involved in the Climate Out train, met the Toucan folks, and just really felt like this was my home. I was super excited about the vision that Celo has shared for the role that blockchain can play in addressing the most pressing challenges of our time, and just happy to be up here exploring what the regenerative finance ecosystem looks like and how we can support it through a DAO, help people find their home in this movement, and just be everybody's fanboy. So that's what I'm up to.
He's definitely my fanboy, for sure.
Me too.
I'm Birju Shah. As I was joking with these guys, I'm known as Kanye of agriculture, right? Probably, no. I'm looking to bring every acre of row crop land on chain, and what that means is that there's 30 data layers of row crop agriculture, the biggest market in agriculture, where farmers have traditionally optimized for yield across the world, and that hasn't optimized for sustainability. And sustainability for us is not only just carbon credits, but moisture credits, biodiversity credits, and those data layers and those that analysis of those layers is what we're looking to accelerate and unlock supply for the rest of these guys over here. So super excited to be here, super excited to bring old school ag industry into the new world and really change the game.
Awesome. So I think it was explained really well by Sepp in his talk about the 5 characteristics of money. We understand what Web3 and what ReFi can do, or what ReFi can do for Web3, but I think I want to ground ourselves in a little bit why Web3 is useful for climate. And so I think, the way that I've thought of it best is that climate change is a mass coordination problem. Web3 is a mass coordination tool, but there's a lot more to it than just that. So Phil, I think I'd start with you by helping us understand why is it that we are using blockchain technology in Web3 to tackle this particular problem?
Yep. Fundamentally, what a carbon credit and other agriculture credits actually are database entries. Right now, all of those database entries are stored in SQL databases that are permissioned and controlled by centralized parties who basically decide who can and cannot have access to them. What Web3 and blockchain technology does is it basically opens up entirely who has access and the level of transparency and liquidity that can actually be brought to these credits at the deepest fundamental level. You know, anytime you have a database entry that is owned, we should just call it a token. And obviously, we've all been in the Web3 space for a long time and believe everything should be tokenized, but carbon credits and agricultural credits in particular are some of the best use cases for blockchain technology because it just creates a true transparency layer into where those credits came from, where they are going, and who is using them, and also opens up the access to who can control them. Right now, it is almost impossible for an individual and most corporate entities to actually custody carbon credits. And so therefore, their ability to use them is limited by the ability of others to provide a conduit to them. So there's this huge friction layer where people actually are rent seeking in the industry. And so that money is not getting back to the project and the people who are creating the credits.
Yeah. Also, feel free, anyone, to jump on to any particular answer if you want. I mentioned in advance. Oh, okay. Okay.
Whatever Phil said.
Okay, so I think we understand a little bit better why Web3 is suitable for ReFi, and sort of we have a little bit of a definition. So I think in speaking about incentives and incentive structures, there's a really excellent book by Kate Raworth called Donut Economics. And what it says is that in one particular chapter, there is a chapter about how creating incentives for particular behaviors, for example, like taking public transit, recycling, have great short-term benefit, but may have detrimental long-term benefit. So I think this is something that we need to be aware of in ReFi. So Nirvaan, I'll go to you. Sort of how do we tackle that, and how does ReFi have the ability to sort of not fall into that particular pitfall, and what are some of the interesting things that you've seen and interesting projects that are sort of dealing with that particular externality?
It's a great reference and fun question. It's a bit of a, so let me answer that with an example here. So say if every time, something as simple as littering and trash disposal, if we debited everyone's Valora wallet by 1 CUSD every time they littered, then we're inadvertently creating kind of a cost of littering, which some people might be okay with. Whereas on the flip side, if we are incentivizing, say, $1 per piece of trash picked up for over a certain period of time, and then we take away those incentives, again, we may have created a structure that in the long run, in the short term, we may have had a lot of success there, but in the long run is not a sustainable way to incentivize these behaviors. So thinking more beyond, well, essentially this impact to earn model can take many different forms that we have here. So instead of giving someone a token, you can, in theory, with local context, you could potentially give cell phone minutes or free access to public transportation or any of these other kind of like-for-like benefits that are rewards that really resemble traditional rewards programs, but kind of form the basis of either a local currency or a community currency that from then we can really build on that in a far more sustainable and a long-term way.
I just want to emphasize this.
Please go.
I think we kind of fetishize incentivization, and we should be thinking very critically about when it's not appropriate to introduce incentive models. So, agreed.
Yeah, I definitely agree. This is about creating long-term structural changes. And so if we don't incentivize at the beginning those long-term structural changes and we just incentivize short-term behaviors, we're just not going to set ourselves up for long-term success.
Go ahead, John.
There's an interesting framework from a guy named BJ Fogg that talks about when behavior happens. And I think it's a fascinating model to explore because it basically says that in order for a behavior to occur, 3 things have to come together at the same moment: motivation, ability, and a prompt. And I think a lot of crypto economics is looking at the kind of motivation side. But I think what's fascinating about the kind of mobile-first approach of the Celo vision is that it actually makes that motivation so much easier to do because it's in your pocket. And you don't need to have the understanding of private keys and how to manage them. And so I think things like Valora in particular play a really fundamental interface for creating this behavior change on the ground. Because at the end of the day, if you're trying to get 9 billion people on the earth to fundamentally alter their behavior, it has to be really, really easy to do. And yes, it has to be economically viable, but I think there's also this kind of social validation layer of what's the norm. And that's where prompts can come in, because people are signaling through their own behavior, through their own profile pictures, through their own clothes, whatever they're doing, about what is the acceptable thing to do. So this is another lens by which I like to think about behavior change in the context of ReFi and the role that crypto plays in this whole movement.
Please.
I love that framework, because if you think about 300 years ago, and Craig and I have talked about that, the US government lost corn and soy subsidies. And then the norm of basically our whole food supply chain system is because of those subsidies 300 years ago, right? The way that we eat meat, the way that we produce ethanol, the way that we produce feed. Imagine if the US did pea protein as a subsidy 300 years ago. Probably we'd all consume a lot less meat. The soil would be very diverse. We'd be able to farm European soil for the next 10,000 years, and we haven't. So I love that framework, and I think that what DeFi, regenerative finance, is doing is providing that new social motivation for farmers who actually are very sick of the centralization, right? I mean, the corn subsidies have led to Monsanto and John Deere centralizing and dominating a lot of what they do. Everything from the OpEx, CapEx, to what they plant in the ground, and then the big US foods are the ones that distribute it globally, right? We have this opportunity to give sustainability in a broad sense, or carbon credits, or chemical runoff as another optimization equation for them, where they can make just as much money, but they actually want to be stewards of the land at the same time, and they're incentivized to do that. So I love that framework of a new norm for them. They've been wanting this for a while. And we're talking about large farmers. JJ in Hastings, Nebraska, that owns 30,000 acres that him and his 95-year-old dad farm still. Traditional Monsanto GMO farmer. He wants to do something different. And I think they're waiting for a community like this to serve them. So I'm super excited to hear this.
So yeah, actually, J.E., I'd like to follow up with you on one particular piece of what you said, because you talked a little bit about incentives and sort of the ability of being able to be mobile first and sort of get this in the hands of many more people. So what I want to talk about a little bit is stakeholders. You and I have had conversations about this a little bit, and what we've spoken about is the principles of environmental justice, which were written many, many years ago. So for any of you guys who do not know, make sure to take a look. It is a document that I keep on my fridge at home, and it sort of grounds a lot of the work that we do. But I think what we sometimes ignore, but what we have a real opportunity to do in ReFi is to make sure we get the stakeholders correct. So like, how do you think about, and then everyone else as well, how do you think about making sure to incorporate all the necessary stakeholders? So for example, in many parts of the world, we should be, granting rewards and incentives to entire communities, and how do we sort of manage a lot of these complex relationships for the people who are going to do the hard work of actually tackling climate, right? We want, as Renee and Merrick and Sep mentioned at the beginning, we want to have prosperity for all, so we want all of those stakeholders to see the upside of tackling this mass coordination problem.
Totally, thanks Craig. And yeah, I'm so grateful for that being the heart of this movement at Celo, recognizing that there's a huge amount of people who are not at the table, but who have the greatest stake in this crisis at this time, where the detrimental effects of climate change are disproportionately allocated to the people who are already marginalized, who are already struggling. And our economic system perpetuates this paradigm and makes it easier for people who have money to grow money. And so they're getting absolutely ravaged by this compound effect of the economic state and the ecological state. And so I think this has really been a journey of, for me, trying to understand what are the things that I can do in my own life. John likes to talk about this, being aware of your locus of control. What can you actually influence? And I think as we're creating these new types of organizations, we need to be incredibly critical about the barriers that are inherent in these systems, and making sure that we actually deploy capital to overcome these barriers and to prompt people from outside our circles of influence, from outside of our networks. Because most likely, given where we've come from, we probably have people in our networks that look and think and feel and act like us. But if we don't deploy money, incentives, if we don't go to networking events, if we don't show up in the flesh in parts of the world that are being marginalized and are at the greatest risk for catastrophic effects of climate change, we're just going to see DeFi and ReFi become a lot like, the tech space that is today. And if that happens, we will all fail. And if we don't redesign our financial system to, incorporate negative externalities while looking at the, injustice of the earth and people, we will also fail, right? This isn't just about concentration of carbon dioxide. This is about rethinking what it means to be human. Yeah. And that's why I absolutely love this kind of metaphor of the mycelium layer underneath, because we can recognize that, when our neighbors in sub-Saharan Africa are, suffering to grow food because temperatures are so extreme, that's going to be us suffering too. This isn't a us and them dynamic. We are all in this together, and we need to, be very intentional about overcoming these barriers.
Woo!
Go ahead, I think about how a lot of what we're trying to do is build this new type of infrastructure, right? A digital infrastructure to facilitate basically the way we communicate value to each other, right? I think money is an information technology. It's how we communicate value. And one lesson which is very obvious to an architect, but might not be so obvious to us, is that the spaces that we occupy characterize the tone of our interactions. And as designers of this infrastructure, I think we need to be thinking very carefully about this, but I think even more than thinking about how to design the infrastructure so that it facilitates and fosters interactions of care, I think we need to be thinking about how we can adapt the infrastructure. Because I look back at my parents' generation and see all of these mistakes that were made, but I know that they were all doing their best, right? They were all bringing the best intent. And I think we have to recognize that we're in the same shoes, right? We don't have the answers, and future generations will look back at me and say, what an idiot. So let's and I think it ties into, we respond to our environment, and to some extent this is about individual agency, but it's also about community and making sure that people exist in an environment where the natural course of action is one that kind of engenders this care.
Yeah, go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I think it's actually about creating a global movement, right? We have to have a global consciousness change around what we are doing and how we are doing it, and giving access to people and empowering people to make a change. Right now, the current system is set up where most people feel powerless. Everyone looks at it and says, I have climate anxiety, what can I do? Can I go buy some more paper straws, right? And no one thinks about, there's actually something tangible that I can do today to actually help this and move the system forward and actually create a better planet for everyone. And we spend a lot of time thinking about, as we build out this infrastructure with the players who are already involved in the ecosystem, how do we think through all of the intended and unintended consequences of everything that we're doing all the time? Because there is an entire industry right now that has embedded interests, and we want to bring that industry together to basically say, we want to open this up and bring more people into it, not push them out of the way.
Yeah. So with all of that said, I think I want to start talking a little bit about the roadblocks and sort of some of the opportunities that we have as a result of those roadblocks to really making sure that this hits much more mass adoption. So Birju, I'll start with you, and then I'd love to hear others' opinions on this as well. I think in my mind, a lot of the roadblocks sit on the supply side of this rather than demand side. Getting high quality, verifiable, carbon assets to be able to have individuals and or larger corporations or anyone be able to purchase is kind of one of the main things that we need to work out. So I'd really love to hear, A, what your opinion on that is, but two, what are some of the things that are being done to A, work with, the current standards that are in place, and two, how can we also help to create new standards?
The world has been a black box. We need to just break it, right? What I mean by that is just that there's been so much data collected by centralized companies for their purpose, whether it's a formation of a GMO or whether it's selling a piece of equipment. There hasn't been this open ag data economy. And even some of the verification engines that have been built 10, 15 years ago, which are great that they exist, but a single project manager, 500 days that a farmer has to pay for to get data verified to then get a credit, it just doesn't work. right? I mean, like, we live in this information age where we have real-time data, we have connectedness, we have so many zoom layers, from satellite to human observational data to these machines that go over the land to sensors in the soil. And, you know, nature is actually very measurable. It very much is. And there's definitely a cost to measure these things, but there's also low-cost ways to measure these things. So I do think a couple things is definitely getting out there and providing the case studies, measuring the farmland or every acre, other land projects, allowing them to establish that it's not just yield, the crop yield where they can make some incentive from, but they can make some incentive for goodness of earth, right? And the stakeholders are so complex, right? The farmer might be incentivized to make money for themselves, but if we make carbon really priced high, they might screw their community by not making food, right? And then at the same time, like, so the zoom levels and incentives are very, very complex. The systems dynamics has to be thought out, but we have to speed up the data collection, the data cleaning, the actual verification. It has to be a day. It can't be, 500 days, and it can't be a single project manager. It has to be an open economy with all the different agronomic and climate methodologies raising the bar on each other to stamp their approval. And then that's going to become real, right?
Yeah.
And it has to be all the farmers on Twitter tweeting out their farm porn, which is yield maps and carbon maps and all that stuff, right? People don't realize farmers love Twitter and Snapchat. And so, we built this, what we call precision agriculture carbon maps. And so in agriculture, in the big ag, they really turned into per acre farming. They used to think in 200 acre levels, now they think per acre. We're doing the same with carbon maps and biodiversity map, where they could zoom in at a 2 centimeter level to see that biodiversity and that carbon that's happening on the field. And that's changing the game. And I think that type of data analysis and verification all needs to be black box cut, right?
Yeah, please, John.
Yeah, I want to touch on that because I think you're asking, like, what are the barriers to entry on the supply side of the market? And I go back to BJ's work because he has this great model unpacking, like, what are the different dimensions of ability? And you have, like, how much time does it take out of my day to, interact with Loam or interact with Toucan or whatever? Like, how difficult is this in terms of the cognitive load? Do I have to make lots and lots of decisions along this path? And also, how deviant from the social norm is this? Are my neighbors going to look at me funny if I'm now doing this method of agriculture as opposed to another? And so I think if we can really start to build interfaces and protocols specifically designed for, the regenerative farmer, for forestry professionals, and for landowners who could convert their land for being used for a regenerative purpose, I think we'll see a real unlock of growth. But it takes that early adopter segment of people to take a risk, because this is a different way of doing things. And I think it's why I'm really excited about some of the work that Adrian at Senkin is doing to try and surface and really celebrate the projects that are actually doing this very hard and challenging work of putting their hands in the soil and regenerating the earth, because it's not easy. And I think, again, if we can create that culture to celebrate those behaviors and make people feel good about taking that leap, about taking that risk, I think we'll start to see a kind of catalytic snowball effect where suddenly regeneration is the norm.
Go ahead, Phil. Or Nirvaan, go ahead.
And one thing to add there about the challenges and roadblocks there. So zooming out a little bit, I think most of us in this room are in agreement that Web3 is a ideal tool towards regeneration, but I think that's not the prevailing opinion in the industry. To most, crypto and climate sounds like an oxymoron or like an internal contradiction. And part of what we also want to do here is build out that community and engage as many climate-curious crypto folks and crypto-curious climate folks as we can, rally everyone under the same umbrella, and then really shift that perception away from blockchain is bad for the environment, because in some ways the transparency does invite criticism. We don't know how much energy is consumed in a Discord server, for example, until you actually really ask the company themselves, I suppose. But yes, I think that perception is also a big part of it, of getting lots of folks rallied behind the same approach towards solving these problems.
So actually, yeah, Phil, I want you to actually comment on this, but I also want to maybe hear an additional comment from you on, we've talked a lot about all of the stakeholders that we need to make sure that we include, but there's another group of stakeholders that we want to make sure that get involved, which is larger entities that are much more risk averse than sort of our typical Celo Connect attendee, who is convinced of the security of wallets, the ability to transact. So if you could, tell us about what you think about what the aforementioned things, and maybe add, sort of some of what you're seeing in bringing some of those stakeholders to the table and getting them to adopt.
Yeah, for sure. I think they're really actually very interconnected. At the end of the day, what we're really trying to create is a system where Loam's platform can go and sit in front of a farmer, and the farmer can go and have all of the data throughout the entire stack, not just about what they're planting, but what the actual value of what they're planting and the credits that could be produced, as well as the actual crops that could be produced, and then create a system where all of that can be instantaneously financed via smart contracts. So literally the data is going to be on chain, and all of the capital is also coming on chain. And so what we're starting to see in the Web 2 and the traditional finance world is that they are realizing very quickly that that is where the capital and the infrastructure for this entire industry is starting to go. And so they're becoming crypto curious. And so even amongst the very legacy players who normally say, I won't touch crypto, they are actually sitting there saying, okay, how can I touch crypto? How can I do this? And so building for them an infrastructure layer that makes this really, really easy for them, where they can still say, I don't touch crypto, but you know what? I do touch whatever that is over there that is built as an infrastructure that has a Web 2 interface that I don't actually have to take custody of a coin. I don't have to figure out who key signers are. That is the key to making sure that all of these legacy players come into this market really fast.
What do we call it? Web 2.5?
Web 2.5.
Okay. So, John X, we've talked a lot about some of the really practical things that need to happen. Now, you and I have had some conversations around some of the more really interesting ideas that could be, hopefully soon, but are a little more radical and interesting and sort of out there. So I'd love for you to sort of tell everyone here about some of the really interesting stuff that you're seeing and sort of where you see it, where you could see it going.
I don't even know where to begin.
Wherever you want.
I think it's important to note that there's this very broad spectrum of imagination happening right now. People thinking of the ways we can use these new information technologies, these new tools of human expression to make a positive impact on the way life is lived on Earth by people and by other species. And I think I'm trying to get more comfortable with the fact that this diversity of thought and like the breadth of expression is so important that we need people thinking about the harebrained ideas just as much as we need people working on the projects that are going to have an impact here and now. So, you know, in the scheme of things, for example, Toucan protocol is a relatively vanilla project, right? Like we take carbon credits from the existing registries and we transfer them onto a blockchain, transfer their functionality onto a blockchain, and it's a carbon token. There's not at the moment, we're not working actively on novel verification methodologies, et cetera. We're really working on getting that base level infrastructure right, because that needs to be very stable, very reliable, a strong foundation on which other people can build with tokenized carbon. But at the same time, there's a ton of really exciting work going on, imagining what Kevin Owocki refers to as these non-skeuomorphic applications of money that are enabled by smart contracts. So one, we're actually lucky to have him here, is an idea put forward by Jonathan Ledgard for a bank for other species. So this is a paper that came out a couple of months ago called Interspecies Money. And the idea is to create an account that is controlled by non-human species, and they can become agents in the economy that can express their preferences and advocate for themselves in the economic system. So an orangutan could pay a veterinarian to come take care of it, or you know, a herd of wildebeest could invest in a business that's going to maintain their habitat rather than it being kind of taken over by an alternative company. A herd of dugongs could invest in a scientific study into their impacts on their carbon sequestration in seagrass. So there are some thorny questions that need to be answered here before this kind of comes to life, but that idea, that's really enabled by the technologies that we're working with. And it's not just blockchain, right? It's also remote sensing and IoT, it's machine learning and artificial intelligence. So that's one. Another idea that we've been developing at Astral is what Pat Rawson refers to as, he talked about this idea of a spatial economic modifier. Another way to put that is, what if money knew where it was in the world, right? And I think Sep talking a bit about demurrage earlier is a really interesting kind of example to look at. So demurrage is a tax on money for how long it's held in an account, right? It's based on time. And what it does is it incentivizes you to spend your money closer to now. So what if instead of demurrage, we could have spatial demurrage, where the further away someone moves from an area of intended economic activity, the more heavy the tax is applied. That would encourage you to spend your money closer to here rather than now. So just, yeah, there's an example. We've been thinking about like dynamic game preserves, that areas of protection move around with animals. There's all sorts.
Yeah, J.E., please.
Yeah, sure, thanks. I love those ideas, John. First time I've heard them. Really excited about it. And I think the first time the interspecies money idea comes to mind, like, I just have to smile. There's something quite playful and beautiful and almost childlike about the ideas that are surfacing in this space. And I think there's a real power here if we can inhabit this childlike curiosity as we do very serious things, like redesign money and address, cataclysmic climate change that could kill all of us. Like, what can we do together if we open our hearts and play like children do and play with the boundaries of this space? And so I think this idea of starting to tether money to time, starting to tether money to space, starting to tether money to different species, like we're starting to see a transition where money is no longer this infinitely growing entity that hypothetically can exist forever. What if it actually looks more like Earth? What if it actually looks and feels more like the living environment? And I think that's quite a fun and playful idea, and I just have really appreciated entering into the ReFi space where this is like a common thing. And I think we can all be our much better selves at work if we can open our heart space as well as our head as we redesign money with, those really detailed mechanisms of economics, but also like how it feels to interact with this system.
Birju, then Phil.
All right. Can you hear me? Yeah?
Yes.
I think of old school healthcare a little bit, and I think of old school healthcare when money started flowing to the outcome of trying to solve cancer or diabetes. A lot of innovations were occurring, right? There were chemical innovations, biological innovations, behavioral innovations. In a digital connected world, there was a lot of, quantify your life to figure out what's going on. And I think that all these innovations on currency, they're going to lead to having to accelerate funding for things that we need for that whole climate change aspect, right? So there's companies like Greenlight Biosciences that basically just copy Moderna, but for Mother Earth, right? They use messenger RNA instead of chemicals that inject, diabetes into Mother Earth for more yield, right? There's other companies out there that are doing things to create the immune system of Mother Earth, an autoimmune system for Mother Earth, right? So she could heal herself, right? And those type of things, I think, is as we develop a currency and a community for, I think we should start funding initiatives like that really can scale faster, and we become a distribution channel to shepherd new areas of science in to really help that overall sustainability equation. So I love hearing the new currency models because I think that we have a responsibility as a community to innovate on top of that to accelerate and shepherd these things in. And so super exciting to hear, but I think there's a lot of companies that we could bring reality to get them into farmland and others.
Phil, please.
One of the most beautiful things about Web3 is the ability to actually experiment and go and try something new really fast and see what happens, right? But one of the sort of consequences of that is that sometimes we run these experiments, we see what happens, and they don't work. And it sort of like makes everyone look at it and go, oh, crypto is bad, right? These people don't know what they're doing. They're cowboys. They're carbon cowboys. They're just out there trying to, mess around and do things, where what we're doing right now is so serious and so pressing, and we need buy-in from large corporations, we need buy-in from large banks, we need large buy-in from all of these legacy institutions. And so while we're playing in the carbon space and while we're playing in this planet-saving space, I think we all just have to be a little careful about going out with massive experiments that may fail without thinking about the consequences of what that failure leads to.
Yeah, that's right.
Fair point.
All right, so with that said, Phil, I think, talking about that we need all of this buy-in, the problem is so important. I do want to ask a little bit about inflection points. It's like, how do we hit the inflection point for ReFi to make sure that it takes off? And kind of where are we? I guess maybe I'll start with you, Nirvaan, and then I would follow up with you, J.E., about like where are we right now in ReFi, and then how and what does an inflection point look like for us? And then I would be curious to hear from some of the others as well. So Nirvaan, please.
So I think we are quite early in ReFi, more or less. We have a couple of carbon assets, tokenized carbon assets from Moss, Toucan, Flow, but lots more to come. And essentially, a lot of the ecosystem that's building kind of composable, interoperable products on top of these protocols is what very excited to see in the coming years. But I do think we are at the moment kind of building out the primitives as well that will kind of form the foundation for a lot of the work that's going on in the future. So I guess there's a lot of different ways to measure this. I mean, total value locked is one of the most common metrics in DeFi. I'm not sure how much it applies here, but I do think that that's an extremely powerful mechanism that we're, as Slobodan and Marcus had presented on the previous talk about the Celo reserve, and essentially using the Celo reserve as a large-scale carbon sink. So as the stablecoin adoption increases, we're essentially intertwining our economic and ecological systems. So I think, I'm not sure exactly what it looks like. I would be curious what other folks on the panel think of what that moment looks like, but I do think we are early on, and that once we have essentially more interoperable applications that are on top of it, we'll see more what it looks like.
Yeah, so thinking about the carbon market as this initial kind of frontier breaking ground of ReFi, maybe we've got 5% of the circulating supply of voluntary carbon on chain, and the voluntary carbon market is much smaller than the compliance market. So it's very early and it's still very small, but we're making an impact and we're getting people to look in this direction. And so I think, in an ideal scenario, the entire global carbon market comes on chain, and the voluntary carbon market and the compliance market basically blend together and merge into one unified system with all of the data publicly available and verifiable on chain. And so I think that, to me, is kind of this initial North Star. But I would say that, if we could get a big name brand fulfilling their net zero commitments on chain and having, again, this social tipping point of saying, this is now the new way to do things because it's better, because anybody can fact check this. And so I think there's like the carbon offsetting piece on one side, but I also think that there's a tipping point on the emissions data becoming something that needs to be publicly verified and scrutinized. Because we're basically trusting a lot of these actors, both at a nation state level, when the annual COP comes together, and at a corporate level. And if we can start to bring publicly verified transparency about emissions and really push people to decarbonize before they're offsetting, I think this is where ReFi becomes a really unique tool in this arsenal of addressing climate change that isn't really being addressed elsewhere because people are just hiding behind closed doors.
I do want to say one thing, which is, I agree, we're early and it's cool, but we're also building on work that has been going on probably forever, right? Vorzel and Demirage experiments, Ostrom, Henry George, local exchange traded systems, the Bristol Pound. This is not new. Grassroots, it's not completely new. What is new is the fact that we now have this new economic environment in which anyone can create and kind of maintain these monetary systems. So, maybe I'm kind of splitting hairs on the definition of what is ReFi, but I think it is worth just acknowledging kind of the giants on whose shoulders we're standing.
Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, so I think the inflection point comes around liquidity. The big difference between the compliance market is that it was set up as a relatively functional market from day one, whereas the voluntary carbon market was not set up on day one to be a liquid market. And what we have an opportunity in ReFi to do is to actually determine where the liquid market actually comes from, right? It used to be that prior to Web3 that if you wanted to market and you wanted to market making something, you had to have large amounts of capital, and only people with huge amounts of capital, banks essentially, and other institutions could determine where a market was and what that market actually was, and also could then manipulate it. Right now, we have the ability to create a movement of people who help to bring liquidity on chain and create the liquidity for the carbon market that makes the rest of the stack work so much easier and gets the financing available to everybody.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the inflection point is here in reality, right? Earth's temperature is warming up, and don't forget about the core temperature. It's cooling down, right? And when that happens, like, we don't farm barley in Iowa anymore. We have to import it for Germany, and that ruined the economy of Iowa for a good 30 years, right? So the reality is there. Now, if I think of currency, I think SEP talks about this as a social contract to make change and incentivize and invest in the things you want to see. The incentive is there in reality, and now we just have to get the whole flow of the supply chain of money to follow that incentive. And so I'm hoping we can do it, and I hope the community realizes that we could actually make change with the current ecosystem that exists. So, I worked at Uber, the worst emissions company on the planet, let's say. Uber Eats cars are terrible emission, and when they think about buying carbon credits, they have no idea what a sustainability report means to them. If the community came to them and proposed a sustainability report that would be adopted by the world, they would see significant change. They don't even have to worry about that adoption. They would just go ahead and think about it as a chain solution that solves their sustainability issues and come up with ideas that they'd adopt. They'd be open to that. And I think that that's where we have to realize that we can play with these big brands and these big ecosystems because everyone sees the reality of the temperature changing for sure.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So actually, Birju, I'd like to hear just a little bit more from you around, because we were talking about inflection points, we're talking about getting all of the sort of right stakeholders to the table. You have worked very directly with farmers, who are on the ground, who are in Nebraska and have 95-year-old 95-year-old fathers who are, walking around with a horseshoe in their back pocket, and working with farmers in Iowa. How do you talk to them about Web3, and how do you convince them that this is the future of their industry and that they should be, opening wallets and understanding that technology, and in particular technology that is, not on paper, is going to help them out?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that you have to realize the reality that 63% of farmland is rented. So farmers that rent land, they don't have an asset value, right? The landowner has the asset value. So the farmer, their whole incentive is to just make a lot of crops and sell those crops for the year because they survive on that crop. When you start talking to them that what they farm and how they farm is actually an asset for the long-term incentive of, let's say, a sustainable Earth, right, or global Earth, they start getting really interested, right? And farmers love games. And what I mean by that, I was talking to Phil about this, is that I need Phil and the other companies here to really establish the price and the liquidity and the debt. But Ravi and I, as a planter, is planting on an acre. In real time, we're sending that data up. We're hopefully calling all the protocols that exist, going down to the farmer and be like, you just made $9 in a data credit. And if you do these 1 or 2 behavior changes, you could make $900 for this season, right? Maybe you could plant sugar beets next time on this acre. That reality they see, and that's the reality that we're facing to them. So, to be honest, we don't really talk about the wallet aspect of it. We talk about how the farmers have always want private access to their data to be able to share it when they want to share it, and the incentive that they get from it. And then we show them that there's this massive marketplace that wants to incentivize them with actual financial products, with pricing that's going up on the demand side, where they actually now have not just a yield optimization equation, but they feel like they have an asset they could also optimize for. And farmers get it. Farmers truly, truly get it.
Great.
And they also love airdrops, and they actually do love crypto, and they're all day traders. You have to realize, big farmers love day trading, they're real estate, they're organic chemists, they're actually quite smart. So, and then, the other thing that we forget about is that the median age of farming is 63 years old. And so the kids are taking over, and the kids love everything that's going on right now.
Yeah.
They don't like farming, but they love the fact that this is coming into farming, and so they might like farming again because this is coming in. So some macro things are happening where the moment in time is now, and I'm very excited about that. But I do think from a user experience standpoint, a lot of things to figure out in this new banking system that we're establishing with all these partners. But from their standpoint, they need to see the incentive, and that's how you have to talk to them.
Yeah.
And if you can get them on Snapchat, getting them a wallet should be pretty easy.
Yeah.
Right? At the end of the day, it's all about making all of this so simple to use that it's not a barrier for anybody.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think we have to wrap up in a second, but the last thing I want to do, and if it can just be, a one-sentence answer from each of you, is just, what are you most optimistic about in ReFi? What gets you most excited? So really quickly, just lightning round through the group, and then we'll call it a panel.
The number of people who actually care and can be empowered by ReFi.
I would say the oceans. Oceans are 70% of the world, and we know not too much about them. So I think that's what I'm really looking forward to.
Yeah, for me, it's the people.
Cool.
That ReFi finally has its Kanye.
I'm just excited for the right incentives to be optimized. And I think that when you think of stakeholders like farmers and others, they just needed that incentive. And I think it's here. And so I'm super excited. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for sharing this time. Thank you all for sharing this time with us. We appreciate it. Awesome.